I'm so glad that Dusty Homan-Sprague could join us this evening. She is fresh off the train from Boston. So, as Sean was just saying, we're a citizen legislature, and I don't know about others who have this experience, but I've never lived in a state that had a citizen legislature. And one of the things that I find so incredible about that is how accessible legislators are. It's not just the legislators that are accessible, though. Here in Maine, the legislative process is accessible as well. People who live in Maine can help suggest bills. They can help pass bills. They can help defeat bills. They can call their legislators. They can write letters to the editor. They can go to Augusta, stand at the State House, and wait for your legislator as they walk outside the chamber. I mean, all of these things, it may sound overwhelming, but it's actually a lot like Old Home Week when you go up into the Capitol and do this. But the process itself, it's rife with language and jargon that doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's a process that can be a little complicated. Every bill gets multiple votes before it finishes through its cycle. It's confusing. And we have a lot of organizations in the state of Maine that do a really good job of helping to prepare citizens to be advocates. And one of the best in the business is Maine Women's Lobby. I was able to send out to all of you last night a link to their citizen advocacy page. I don't know if you've had a chance to look through it, but it's just amazing. They have great videos that Dusty has made, 10-second videos that help you walk through some of that. And what Dusty has put together is a presentation that's going to encapsulate a lot of that for us. After Dusty has spoken, we have Holly Stover, who is here, who's going to talk about some of her bills. We've compiled a list of all of the bills that Holly, Lydia, and Cameron are sponsoring, and we're going to be dropping that into the chat and sharing that with you. A lot of those bills haven't printed yet, and what that means, I'm sure Dusty will talk about in just a moment. It's really exciting to see what our own legislators are putting into the legislative session this year. And Holly's going to talk about some of the top priorities, and then we'll have opportunities for people to answer questions. Dusty has been with the Maine Women's Lobby since 2020. I've had the great pleasure and honor of working with her through a number of occasions through my work with Sue Maine. She joined Maine Women's Lobby after working for 11 years with the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Her passion for organizational infrastructure, policies, and practices that reflect anti-oppression and feminist values has always blown me away. Dusty has a very strong belief that Maine can and should be the kind of place where all people can live free from misogyny and gender-based discrimination. She's committed to ensuring that a healthy and vibrant lobby and education fund is a part of that success. One of the ways she's done that is to help get people more involved in the legislative process. She's joined us tonight to help us walk through that process. Dusty, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you, and so sorry that you had to completely rearrange your schedule just for me. I'm sure you know that there's been plenty of schedule changing today on everybody's part. I was in Boston and my train was canceled, and so this is how it all worked out. I'm so glad that I was able to be here with you. So at the Women's Lobby, we advocate for gender equity and gender justice through the legislative process. But the part that I really just especially love is the part about connecting people to the work. It's been my passion for many years. I grew up in a household that did not do politics. We voted, but I had never been to the State House. I had never met a legislator or an elected official. It just wasn't part of what we thought was normal. We were working class. I was a first generation college student. And so I can remember the first time I brought my dad to the State House when I was in my 20s, and he had never been inside. And he was just astonished that you could go up the front steps, just walk inside. And that's a feeling that still stays with me. So I'd love to chat with you about how you can sort of have that feeling of connection. But first, I just want to take a little temperature. You are obviously here for a political meeting, so I assume that you've got a higher than average amount of engagement. Also, though, elections and then the legislative process aren't always the same. So if you want to show me by sort of waving your actual hand or doing an emoji reaction down at your bottom toolbar, I know you all are voters, but how many people have followed a bill in the legislative process? Okay, so I see some hands, but it's not universal. Great. So not everybody has followed a bill. How many people have actually been inside the State House in Maine? Right. Great. I see a bunch of hands. I also see a bunch of like, no, not yet. That's not me yet. How many people, though, have been to a protest? Okay, I see a bunch of hands there. Great. Well, these are all part of the legislative process. All right, the hand raising, that's a lot. These are all part of the legislative process. And one of the things that I really like about the legislative process is that there are ways to get involved that are quiet and ways to get involved that are loud. There are ways to get involved that are really technical and ways that really are just about the wisdom of your own lived experience. And so wherever you come into the process, there's an opportunity for you to get to bring what you do best or what you know best. You know, I am not much of a protester. Like, I'll go to protests because I know it matters, but that's not where I feel most comfortable. I feel most comfortable like diving in and reading a bill and thinking about its like impacts and where it fits into the law. So I like to get real nerdy about it, but that's not for everyone. And the point is, like, those are all powerful ways to get involved. So I'm going to go through a little infographic that I have for you. I'm dropping it here into the chat. So if following along with my infographic isn't the right way for you on my shared screen, then you can go ahead and look at this document, and you're welcome to use the document however you'd like and share it or whatever you'd like. I also would love to have questions as we go along. I did all of the sexual assault training for the entire Criminal Justice Academy for about a decade. So there is no question in a training that I don't feel prepared to answer. I've seen it all. I can definitely answer any question that you have tonight. And if I can't answer it, then I can figure out how to answer it after. So I know this is a big crowd and it's late and you're probably tired. But like, send me your questions. I can follow along in the chat, and I'm happy to hear from you as well. So, okay, here I go. I am sharing my screen. Okay, you see my screen here? Okay. Good deal. So this is an infographic that walks through, it's sort of a timeline of the legislative process. This does not have a ton of jargon. We really want people to know that the legislative process happens kind of the same, whether you know the fancy language or not. And the reality is, knowing the fancy language is helpful, but it is not essential. So we want to make our tools as readable and accessible as possible. So I think since you're here in this room, you've already shown me that you know that our government makes decisions that affect our lives in big and small ways, and that you can have a role in that. And the first place, as Kelly said, is really starting with the ideas. I can't tell you how important the ideas are in the legislative process. Legislators get their ideas from a lot of different places. Some of them get them from national think tanks, some from state level advocates like ours, some from their own real lived experience or their professional expertise. I'm sure Representative Stover has talked to you about that, or will talk to you about that. Because, you know, things that she brings are her own experience, right? And a lot of legislators really pride themselves on getting the seeds of their ideas directly from their constituents. So whether or not you think a problem that you're facing has a legislative solution, checking in with legislators about the real things that you're facing in your life, whether it's the affordability of, long-term care for aging parents, whether it's about, your worry about the infrastructure for bridges, for climate change. All of these things probably have policy solutions, and your legislator might be the one to sponsor a bill, or they might be the one to vote on a bill. But regardless, the more they hear from you, the better informed they can be as they think about helping push the legislative process forward. When legislators or lobbyists, advocates like myself, are thinking in that early stage of bill drafting or bill writing, a lot of questions that they want to think through. I would say I wish more people thought through the question about, is this a real problem? Is this actually something happening in Maine that's really affecting the lives of Mainers? And would a law actually solve it? I have seen lots of policy proposals that are not answering real problems, or where there is already a law, but people don't know about it, or a law won't solve it. But a lot of times it will, and it's having those conversations early on that can help get us there in a more informed way. And when I say early on, I mean really early on, like immediately after the election or in the summer. I get a lot of calls in February for questions that people have that they would like to solve through a legislative process. And I'll tell you what, February, unfortunately, is not the time for that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't call. You should always call with your stuff. But if you're really at the point where your idea might be a bill, you want to have those conversations early. You want to be having them in June, July, August with legislators, because they are ruled by something called cloture, which is the deadline for submitting bills. It's right after the election, like weeks after the election, in their first year. And in the second year, it's in September. So you're not even thinking about the beginning of the legislature in September, but they are, because they've got cloture hanging over their heads. So the idea, I think, is one of the best places for citizens to get involved in the legislative process and the most overlooked. So once an idea moves into the bill process, or moves past the idea, becomes a bill, every bill needs a sponsor. I talked about that when I talked about having a legislator sponsor a bill, but that is the person who is going to shuttle the bill through its process. They are a legislator. They can be in the House or the Senate. Lots of different styles of sponsorship. Some sponsors are very active on their bills. They want to know everything. They want to write the bills. Some sponsors are really hands-off. They kind of put in the bill and then it's a sink or swim situation. I don't judge. I just, as a lobbyist, my role is to learn how they're approaching it and then help support them in whatever their goals are, as long as their goals match my goals, which are gender, equitable, and feminist policy. So those ideas become titles for a bill. The bill title goes to what's called the revisor's office. I am going to, here's the revisor's office. The revisor's office are the unsung heroes of the legislative process. They are the nonpartisan technical folks who help develop that bill into, or develop that idea into a real piece of possible policy. The opportunities here to get involved as a citizen in this drafting part, generally, if you want to get involved as a citizen, you probably at this point either have technical knowledge, which is often true. I think about my partner. I live in Bath, so I'm neighbors with y'all. My partner is on the solid waste committee. And so Like they have real like lived experience and knowledge and wisdom about solid waste. And that could really translate into the bill drafting process. But it tends to be a little more technical when it comes to bill drafting. But there's like lots of ways to draft a bill. You can get model language from other states. The revisers know a lot about it. Sometimes sponsors know a lot about it. And then sometimes there's an opportunity for you as a citizen, if you're like active and it's your idea, to get to engage at that point too. And that's some of the quiet and technical work I talked about at the beginning. Once a bill has become a title, then it goes to the revisor's office, then it gets language, it moves into the more open and collaborative process. Committees are so essential to the legislative process. The committees are the folks who really dig in on an issue area like agriculture or education or health and human services. That digging in, that legislative digging in and focusing on a topic allows them to build their expertise, to identify trends, to group bills together better, sometimes to hear them all together if they're like on a like topic. As a citizen advocate, knowing what committees your legislator is on can be really helpful, because then, especially if you have knowledge or information or experience that aligns with a committee topic, you can really put yourself forward as a local community expert for your legislators. And if you do happen to have interest or background knowledge on certain issues, you can reach out to committee members, even if they're not your even if you're not their constituents, if you're sort of matching your skills and interest with their work. So every bill has a hearing. In those hearings, that's what we often think about as the opportunity for citizen engagement, because every bill has a hearing and anyone can testify on a bill. It does not matter if you have even the vaguest passing idea of what you're talking about. You are entitled to your 3 minutes just like everybody else. People think of that when they think about engagement and activism, and testifying is really important. But I do want you to know that that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg of advocacy. When it is time for a public hearing, you can submit testimony just in writing. So you can write something up and send it in to them, or you can submit it over Zoom and then deliver that testimony speaking to them, but over Zoom. That is an amazing post-COVID benefit. Or you can actually show up at the State House in person and deliver that testimony live. When you are doing testimony, there are instructions for how to do each of those on our website, and I'm going to show you where to find those instructions. But the only thing that is really important that you share, in my opinion, is what the bill is that you're talking about, why your opinion matters. And that can be anything. That's really like, because I'm a voter, because I'm your constituent, because I also can't afford my childcare, because I also see the problem of solid waste. You know, whatever the issue is, like, you want to make that personal connection, then you want to give them your information, and real lived experience and history is information. And then you make your ask. You ask how you would like them to vote on a bill. After a hearing, things go into the work session, but that work session tends to be not necessarily a great place for citizen engagement other than observing. So the work session is when legislators get their questions answered. They get an analysis of the bill, a summary of everybody who testified, key information or questions answered that they might have had. So they're gathering all their information in addition to the testimony and then making decisions about that bill. So usually the work session happens about a week after the hearing. Not always true, often true. And usually, if it's not too complicated, they will vote at the work session. That committee will vote. If it's more complicated, it might get more work sessions. It might take longer to happen. Their voting might take longer. But that's a general guide. Once the and then a really key part of your activism can be in between that testimony and the vote, though. So because they continue taking information until the work session, those calls, that like outreach to them is really part of the information they hear. For a legislator who's facing votes on 2,000 bills, which is about what we're addressing this session, even 3 calls can make a huge difference, especially if it's, you know, a respectful and compelling call with a story that really matters to them. So this is a real opportunity. And so if you're not the sort of person who either can drive to the State House or wants to stand up in that kind of forum, making those direct calls or direct email, direct written note. One thing I will say about email is they get a lot of them. So calls and handwritten notes tend to be slightly more effective. Just because, as you may know, if you're the kind of person who gets hundreds of emails a day, it's hard to wade through them all. Anybody on this call who's ever tried to email me knows that email is not always the most responsive way to get in touch with people. So the committee votes, they make a recommendation to the legislature. This is an important technical piece. So they may recommend that the bill die, but that recommendation is going to go to the legislature regardless, to the full legislature. So then we get down into the House or the Senate. If the primary sponsor is in the House, the bill is going to start there. If the primary sponsor is in the Senate, it's going to start there. And then it's going to swap a couple of times. So once it's going to go back and forth, there's a whole lot of action happening. The thing I would say to you all as you think through this, if you're not actively working on a bill, if you're not actively like moving something forward and dedicating your resources to it, don't worry too much about the timing here. Just worry about making sure you get your information to your legislator and the people who are going to vote. Like, don't think too hard about whether it's the vote for enactment or engrossing or like all of these things. And frankly, even I've been a lobbyist for 17 years and I don't think too hard about that. By the time a bill gets down to the wire in these back and forth votes, most of the work has been done. And it was done in January, February, March. So I'm making sure I'm following along with the chat. Okay. All right. So the bill is going to start in one chamber. It's going to go to the other, and then it's going to come back for a final, like if it starts in the House and then it goes to the Senate, it comes back to the House to make sure that Senate vote was accurate. And then it goes back to the Senate to make sure that second House vote was accurate. Like that's why the back and forth thing. This part is not designed to be very accessible. So then it's in the reverse. At that point, once it passes, it probably goes to the governor. It's voted there on the recommendation for the committee. So if the committee recommends, should this bill die? Then they're voting whether or not the bill should die. That part gets confusing too. it is helpful to understand the nuance of how those votes happen. And again, I would say, like, don't stress about not knowing that. And it's a good reason to be connected to people who are really engaged in the day-to-day life of a bill, like me, or like folks at, Suit Up Maine, or Maine Center for Economic Policy, or Maine Equal Justice, or whoever your friends are that are focusing on issues that you really care about. If a bill has a funding note attached to it, though, this is a place where it can go through that whole process. You think you've got it through, and then, oh, there are budget implications. And to some extent, that has its whole own additional, it does the whole thing again, but just from a budgetary perspective. So a bill can pass and then not get funding. And if that happens, then the bill dies. That's why.
Dusty, if I could just interject real quick, people here might remember that was something that happened to one of Holly's bills in the last legislative session. She had put through a bill that would have provided much needed funding to the lobster industry to help them purchase equipment that was needed and make adjustments that were needed to meet federal regulations. The bill passed overwhelmingly and it died on the appropriations table because it didn't get funding. I just wanted to bring that up because that might help connect people with what you're saying to something we know happened here in Lincoln County.
And it happens really regularly. As a lobbyist, one of the first questions I ask about a bill is if there are funding implications, because that is going to often be the death knell of a bill. That's actually the founding of the women's lobby, is because a group of citizen women put forward a bill. They thought they had done absolutely everything, and then it died on the last night of the legislature. They came back the next year to create the women's lobby with $2 memberships, and we're still at it 43 years later because we have not solved the problem of gender equity. But that bill funding portion tends to be much more quiet, much more closed door, much harder to understand, and not at all accessible to the general public, including lobbyists and, frankly, legislators. For the legislators on the call, sorry. I think we can all agree, though, the funding process is complicated. I hope. But assuming it makes it all the way through there, and so that part, I guess I'll say, as a citizen advocate, it is harder to figure out what to do and how. And this is a place where if you really want to be diving deep on a bill, you probably want to be having a conversation with people who are working regularly on the bill. And throughout this process, those folks, the lobbyists or interest groups, or activism networks, they're going to be in touch with you about opportunities for more public facing, like protests or visibility at the State House or special events. Those can happen at any point in this process, and kind of any point is the right point to do it. What matters is making your voice known and showing sort of the power of your movement. And then finally, bills go to the governor to get signed or to get vetoed. If they get vetoed, they go back up to the House and Senate for an override vote, hopefully, a 2/3 override vote, or the veto is sustained, in which case it dies. I do want to briefly show you here, as Kelly said, we have a little citizen advocacy toolkit, helps you find your legislators, gives you models for how to reach out, talks about how to do testimony in person or on Zoom. We've got a bunch of short little videos like how-tos, these TikTok explainers. These are those quick little segments, and a giant bill tracker here that we're updating every week. This, of course, is all specific to gender equity. So if climate change is your bag, it's probably not going to be on here. But otherwise, there's a lot here with plain language descriptions. I know I am, I'm at my time, but I think there's time for a few questions. I'm happy to take them. And then in general, what I want people to go away with is the knowledge that like there are many ways to be involved and there's no right way. All of the ways have to happen in order for this process to work and to make better public policy for all of us.
Esty, thank you so much. I highly recommend going to that citizen advocacy page that has been dropped into the chat. When Dusty was talking about the TikTok videos, I was telling her this the other day, I just can't learn another social media channel. So I don't do TikTok, but you don't have to do TikTok. All these videos are up on their website. So all you got to do is go to their website, click, they're 10 seconds long. They explain every step of the process. They're just wonderful. Can't recommend those highly enough.
And I'm making more like all the time. I just posted one today. So if you have questions, like email them to me and I'll answer them on TikTok for you. And then everybody will have the benefit of that information.
If there are any questions specifically for Dusty, we could do those now. Otherwise, we could hold off because our next speaker is going to be Holly Stover. So are there any questions immediately related to something that Dusty just said and that you wanted to get clarified before we move forward? If there are, just raise your hand. And I'm not seeing any. So I'm going to drop a link into the chat that goes to a Google document that includes all close to 40 bills that Representative Stover, Representative Crafts, and Senator Rennie are sponsoring this year. As Dusty was saying, there's a whole sort of complicated process that a bill goes through. We try to explain some of that at the top of this document. You'll see something called an LD number. You'll see something called an LR number. That's all explained in the document and what that means. But one of the things that's so exciting to me is all three of our legislators have bills that they have introduced based on conversations they've had with people right here in Lincoln County. And that shows that the process when you can get involved in it. So I've asked Holly to join us and to offer some of her thoughts on some of her priority bills, some of her own bills that she's sponsoring, bills being sponsored by others that she's going to be particularly keeping an eye on. And I do want to say that both Lydia and Cameron could not join us tonight, but they are very eager to talk with people about the bills that they're sponsoring as well. So we'll have other opportunities for them to share that. Holly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Dusty, for making it sound so calm and straightforward, how the process goes. As you know, the process, as Dusty laid it out, it does go like that, but there's herky-jerky moments and some roller coaster rides, or more like sometimes Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, if you've ever been to Disney World. And just at the last minute, when you think something is going in a particular direction, you can take that sharp turn and go in another direction, and you just have to be incredibly nimble and able to move. And as always, I love the process. I love how we do our work and that we do it for all of you. For those of you I haven't met yet, I think I know most everybody. My name is Holly Stover. I represent House District 48, and I proudly serve the communities of Boothbay Harbor, Southport, Edgecombe, Westport Island, and South Bristol. And this, I'm in my 5th year. I'm in my 3rd term. And hopefully, if God is willing, I'll see a 4th term. So I love what I do. And I think it's been said before, I may be in writing, I'm serving this term as the House Chair for State and Local Government, which is a different kind of committee for me. And just to give you a sense of what we do everything from abandoned roads to naming of bridges. We had hearings last week on things like making the Needham. And if you're not from Maine, the Needham is a confectionery, a candy made of, in my life, it was made of leftover mashed potato and coconut and then dipped in chocolate. It's pretty remarkable if you like coconut. But anyway, we're going to make it the state confectionery, I hope. And on a more local basis for folks in Lincoln County, we had a hearing in state and local government on having the Saturday before Memorial Day be the state Alewife Day, which is a really big deal for us, both economically, but also a lot of family traditions around going to watch the ladders and see the fish move and spawn. So that was very exciting for me personally. So state and local government also oversees the Secretary of State's office, the Office of the Treasurer, the Office of Audit, and DAFs. That's Department of Administrative and Financial Services, which includes more of state government than you probably realize, and very comprehensive, including all state facilities, state revenue service, and a number of other administrative and financial services that state government is involved with, including the Bureau of Human Resources. So it's very comprehensive what we do in state and local government. And I also am proud to serve on the new interagency select committee on housing. And when I was out doing doors everywhere I've been, certainly everywhere in Lincoln County, affordable housing is on everyone's mind. And we have very little either to buy or to rent. So we are working both on some of the efforts around LD 2003, which we talked about extensively last year, I think, everywhere. But looking at ordinances, zoning, and then how do we bring resources to bear so that we can develop more housing in Lincoln County, because we are a housing desert. So I'm very excited to be on that committee as well. So I'm going to move on to some legislation. And in addition to the bills that Kelly's listed, what we don't capture this time around is the number of bills we co-sponsor with either senators or representatives. We're frequently either running around asking other people to co-sponsor with us, and they're running around asking us to co-sponsor with them. And we can get into those bills at another time. The bills I put in this session, you always start out, at least I do, I'm going to just do 6. And it just creeps up. It just keeps creeping up, and you talk to somebody else and then you move on another bill, and just lobbyists approach you and say, this was a bill. Sometimes it's a carryover, something that didn't pass last session or 3 sessions ago, that it's time to bring back because things change. The makeup of the bodies change, and there's an opportunity to bring something back and hopefully pass it. So in addition to the bills that I'm going to talk about tonight, and you have copies of all my bills, I'm also co-sponsoring a number of bills, and bills can keep coming. I have something I've been working on this week, even though we've been off, that I'm bringing to the revisor's office tomorrow morning, first thing. And we'll see how that goes, because we'll have to go through Ledge Council to get permission to bring in another bill, but it's a really important one. So I hope we'll be able to make it. Let me get rid of this pop-up. Thank you. So a couple of the bills I wanted to talk about, and one of them is an LR because it hasn't yet been printed. It's in process. And that's the one I'm going to talk about first. And that's LR 256, which still doesn't have an LD number. But it's an act to amend the state's drunk driving laws, which I think I will, even when it does come out, probably amend the title, because I want to get to the heart of what it really means. So in this state, if you're convicted of vehicular manslaughter related to an OUI charge, so you're drunk driving and you hit and kill somebody else. This specifically speaks to if you kill someone's parent, the parent of a minor child, or parents, which happens. Fortunately, does not happen as often. It does not happen often, but if it happens once, then I think it demands our attention. And what this bill seeks to do is to enforce that you will pay child support to that minor child until they turn 18. And the reason why I feel really passionate about this is that if first of all, losing your parent to a drunk driver for any reason is absolutely devastating. Losing your parent to a drunk driver, in my mind, means that that driver has a certain accountability to that minor child. And that losing your parent oftentimes can result in you going from having perhaps even middle class or greater to a life of poverty. You've lost your parent who had a job, and you're now on Social Security, survivor benefits, and whoever is raising you, whether it's your grandparent or your guardian, is going to need assistance in order to give you the kind of life your parent or parents would have wanted you to have. Even if the surviving parent, they've lost half the income of the house. So what this would seek to do, and beyond the civil penalty, because, and if you track cases at all, drunk driving convictions of vehicular homicide often bring, and David Levesque was on here, he probably can speak to it, but oftentimes give sentences of 2 to 3 years. Sometimes I've seen 18 months, 2 to 3 years that you serve in jail, most of that suspended. But what this would ensure, if your guardian, if the child's guardian wants to waive their right to civil penalty, which means they're not going to sue the driver, they're going to accept instead this child support payment. And that child, that surviving minor child or children will receive that till they turn 18. And I have put this bill in. Since I put it in, there's been a couple of other people put it in. It's based on a law in Tennessee, I believe, called Bentley's Law, which is making its way around the country. I've spoken to the grandmother who is raising her 2 grandchildren, and her son and daughter-in-law were killed by a drunk driver. So I've been working, Desi talked about how you work with various constituencies. So I've been in conversation and working with MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for almost a year now about this bill. And how I learned about it, it came from some girls attending the Boothbay Region High School, and they read it somewhere. And they called me up and they said, we really want this to be a law in Maine, because we want children who are abandoned because of a drunk driver. We want them to have this. And so that's where we're at. I'm waiting for it to be printed. And so how it will we work? It's a little more complicated, where 2 other people have submitted the same bill. That's based on the number, which mine is LR 256, which is pretty low. It means it came in almost as soon as cloture opened up and we could start filing. I filed it. And when it comes out, those other people, one is a senator and one is a representative, they'll be co-sponsors with me. That's one of the bills that I have that I think is really compelling, because I'm excited about it. I'm excited about it because I think it has the potential to have impact for a very long time. And also it has the potential to really benefit the life of a child. So that is one of my bills, and we can talk about that after. I'm just going to go right into the other one, which is a little more complicated. It's LD 545. And LD 545, just getting, the titles don't often reflect what you think you put in, but it is currently, it's an act to establish the Department of Early Childhood. So I'll give you a little bit of background on my own work history. I worked for DHHS for almost 24 years. And in various roles, I worked with parents, and I worked both in my home community, in my career lifetime, where I've been approached by parents who have children with special needs. And we're talking about just the birth to 3 services, the early childhood pieces, which are critically important, because if you want a child to be both early identification and be able to get the right resources as quickly as possible and for the right amount of time, you oftentimes can bring them along developmentally. So some of the services they may not need beyond. So I'm just going to give you a brief. So if you can imagine, and if you have had a child of your own that has special needs, this may sound, you may remember some of this. So in the state system, the Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems Program, so across the spectrum of DOE, Department of Education, and over on a different part of town, across the street, there's DHHS. 2 big departments, 2 huge departments. And within those departments, they have programs that serve children from the 0 to 3 population for early identification. And some of those programs include Help Me Grow, the developmental screening, early childhood consultation partnership, the maternal and child health. It's a block grant and a program, and that's within the CDC. Partners in care coordination, and the children with special health care needs, which often is connected, if you're familiar with Katie Beckett. And then the state's plan of safe care. There's Cradle Me, early intervention under the Children with Disabilities Education Act. And within all of that, there's things like CDS and other early identification. So it's very confusing. If you can imagine having you have your one little child and you have all those systems, and there are touch points all the way up until that child enters pre-K, is eligible for school, where you're supposed to enter and leave these systems, or you might need to. And it is not simple. There's no navigation system. There's no easy roadmap. And so this bill seeks to do an inventory of all of these systems, and to track what are the funding streams, how much do they have, what are the program requirements, is it state or federal dollars, all the things you'd want to do almost in a mapping or inventory process. And take all of that information and bring that to a working group to review the inventory, to look at the program outcomes, to look at the financing. And then we have a structure within state government now, the Maine Children's Cabinet, reinstituted and put in place by Governor Mills when she came in her first term, and for this information from this working group to come back to the Maine Children's Cabinet, which is comprised primarily of either the commissioners or commissioner designees for each of the state departments involved in the lives of children. Excuse me 1 minute, I have a tickle. So what this bill also would do is have the Children's Cabinet make a data-driven plan and submit that plan back to DOE and DHHS, the committees of jurisdiction over the programs. And also it calls to create a cabinet level position that would be created and funded to provide supportive services to children 0 to 3 and their families, so that we streamline this better, we make it more effective and efficient and less cumbersome for the families and especially the children they are intended to serve. So that's a rather cumbersome bill, but if you really think of systemic change and how we can improve the way families are treated, when you have a child who has special needs, I think oftentimes if you identify that sooner around the birth or even in the first year of life, it's devastating and there's tremendous loss oftentimes. And this would allow a much clearer pathway for parents and for children as they navigate their way through these systems. And ideally, they get the right treatment in the right amounts and get those very young children off to the best start possible. And right now it's clunky and things don't always go well. And this is really looking to an overall a systems improvement to make the lives of the children better and get them off to a better start. I have a number of other bills, but we don't have time tonight. Some of those have to do with children, at least one of them. I'm going to touch on one really brief one, and it illustrates how something can go. I had another bill last session, LD 1824, and what that was looking at, if you look at DHHS, if you're familiar at all, there's a lot of bills in this session around child welfare. Child welfare, mental health, and substance abuse remain high priorities, but child welfare has been particularly troublesome. So my bill last session, LD 1824, was to look at pre-petition. So that's the period of time before a petition is filed around intervening and taking custody of a child. So in that pre-petition phase, which can be very early in a case, there are no civil legal services. If you do not have money to hire an attorney, one will not be appointed for you, because it is a civil legal process of pre-petition services when the state knocks at your door. And the situation I've been most involved in is when you have a non-offending parent raising children and you have the offending parent in a domestic violence case. There have been situations historically where the non-offending parent, often the mother of the children, would lose custody of that child because it was an unsafe environment, because a lot of stuff is coming at you at that time when someone comes to your door and says there's been allegations of jeopardy, when it could have been the offending parent that called in DHHS and said, she does this to the kids or that to the kids. But in this pre-petition phase and you don't have any civil legal representation, LD 1824 aimed to provide that. And so it was clear coming down to the wire at the end of the session that we were not going to have the votes coming out of committee, certainly not for unanimous report. So I was able to work actually with Speaker Talbot Ross, who was the assistant majority leader at the time. And she had a bill that was on the study table. So if you can't get your bill passed, you can always ask to go to study or resolve. So I asked for a study to look at this issue of civil legal representation, which is much like the indigent legal representation you've heard a lot about, but it's for a very particular population for a very short amount of time. And we had a study over the summer. We had a very well-rounded group. We met monthly. we came back with a final report and recommendations. And so one of the bills I'll be bringing forward this session is based on the recommendations of that study group. And we will be recommending that that we move forward and provide civil legal services for non-offending parents in that pre-petition phase of a child protective case. What the data shows nationally is that those children are less likely to come into foster care. They actually get some services and they do very well because they had good representation in court or before court ever happened in the pre-petition phase. So I'm excited about that bill because I think there's no reason to bring children into foster care if it is safe. Always, always, always. Highest priority is child safety, and there's no level of jeopardy. And if there was level of jeopardy because of an offending parent and that person is no longer in the home, then there's no reason to remove those children because it adds additional mental health problems, including abandonment and loss. So that's another one. There's a funding bill around sexual assault advocates who have starting salaries of around $32,000 a year. Let that sink in. So I'm pretty excited about that one. I'm a co-sponsor with Senator Doosan. And we have a whole bunch of other bills that we can talk about another time. But it's a very busy session. Bills are starting to get printed and come out a little more quickly than they had been. And there's still lots of work to do. And we passed the supplemental budget. So what else could you do? We've been doing absolutely nothing.
Thank you so much, Holly. As Holly was saying, I mean, there's so many more bills and they're all really good. Dig into that list and offer suggestions for ways we can improve it. I want to draw your attention to the chat if you can. Do votes on legislation only need a simple majority? In other words, they just need, a majority vote, or do they need to have a bigger? Dusty, I know you wrote your comment in the chat, but could you just explain briefly about how that works?
Generally speaking, a bill only needs a simple majority for the committee's report to come out of the committee and then go before the full House or Senate. If the report is unanimous and fairly not controversial, it will often do what's called going under the hammer. That means all of the bills that are sort of non-controversial get lumped together and they get like a straight up or down vote. They don't get picked apart or have a floor debate. So that's a simple majority. It can go under the hammer. If it's more controversial, it will probably have a floor debate. And then even still, it mostly just needs a simple majority. Some bills, like a constitutional amendment, though, require a 2/3 support in the House and the Senate.
Thank you. There's so many questions about how this all works, but I think I'm hearing from people here, we've come full circle in this meeting tonight. We've talked about an election and getting someone into office, and now we're talking about what happens when they're in the office. And they're equally important. They take an equal amount of citizen action, although it comes at it from a different angle. And hearing directly, I think, from a legislator about a bill that they're sponsoring, where it came from, how this bill originated, the backstory, it makes it's more than just legislative mumbo jumbo that comes out of the revisor's office. These are real pieces of action that affect our daily lives. So one thing I do want to let you all know, we are creating a legislative advocacy page for our website that's going to include a lot of links out to the resources that Dusty has from Maine Women's Lobby. It's going to include a link to other bill trackers that are managed by groups like Maine Women's Lobby, ACLU of Maine, the Environmental Priorities Council, the Wabanaki Alliance. They all have bills that they're all individually tracking, and that way you can see if your interest is in environment, you're going to go to the Environmental Priorities Coalition tracker, and that's where you're going to find the bills that are going to need the heavy lifting. So we're a part of this Legislative Advocacy 101. We're putting together a list of links where you can go in to sign up to receive the legislative emails from your legislator. All of our legislators have an email that goes out, I believe, once a month, and it has some updates in it. But we're going to encourage all of you to contact your legislator on a bill you support or on a bill you oppose. And it doesn't matter if your legislator is a Democrat, Republican, or independent, they need to hear from you. And that call saying, I support this bill and I want you to support it too, can be just as important as the call saying, I want you to vote against this bill. Because if you've got a bill that's a little bit tricky, a little controversial, if your legislator hears from their constituents, you're giving them cover. When those come up, write Holly, ask her to oppose them. She needs to be able to say, I heard from this many constituents, I'm voting no on this because I'm listening to the people I represent. So it's not just about writing somebody about a bill that you support or oppose, it's writing them. Well, I want to thank Dusty for rushing to get here from the airport. I want to thank Holly as always. And in absentia, I'd like to thank Lydia and Cameron because they're sponsoring some great bills. We're going to look to create some more opportunities for all of you to hear from all of our legislators about these bills. We'll think about ways that we can do that. I know one thing we can do in every one of our monthly meetings, we give some time on the floor to our legislators who are in attendance to talk about things that are pressing. We could absolutely make sure we give a little bit of extra time for that moving forward so that our legislators can talk about these priority bills, votes that are coming up, ways that you can get engaged. Well,
so before we go, I just want to mention one other thing, which is Representative Allison Hepler, who used to serve part of Lincoln County, who does not at this time. I'm a co-sponsor on a bill that she's the lead sponsor of, and we're working with Marge Kilkelly, former state senator, former state representative, actually former president of the Senate, former staff person, senior policy advisor for Angus King in his Washington, D.C. office, and farmer in Dresden, who has a dog named Percy, who's absolutely phenomenal. And in this state, if you hit a deer, a moose, or a wild turkey, you're by law required to report that. That's it. That's your only requirement. Nothing's going to happen to you. You're just going to call up and say, I hit a deer. But not our own domestic animals, not a cat, not a dog, and not livestock, like not your sheep or your goats. So anyway, short story is Percy, her dog, Joe and Marge's dog, got hit by a car 3 years ago. And the person drove off, and the neighbor was walking the dog on a leash and almost hit the neighbor too. But the driver sped off and they never found out who did it. And Percy had extensive surgeries, and it was very traumatic because he was their puppy and he is their dog, and they love him very much. So we've had a lot of press coverage, more coverage on that than I think anything I've ever done, but that's because Marge Kilkelly knows how to run a bill. That's what I've learned. And she put out her own press release. So there's going to be a lot more attention. We've had Channel 6, the Kennebec Journal, the Lewiston Sun, the Bangor Daily News, the Portland Press Herald, and we haven't even had the hearing scheduled yet. So more about Percy and Marge and this incredible piece of legislation, because it sounds like a small thing, but our dogs, our cats, we love our animals, right? And I love Percy. Percy can actually read, but he's Marge Kilkelly's dog, so of course he can read. So you're going to see a lot more probably in the press about this bill, and it's not a small matter. It is a small bill. The only fine is if you don't call and report it. It's not even, it's just a little smack to say, hey, do the next right thing, call and say, I hit the dog. So anyway, we're working on that. And that's an example of, a representative reaching out to me because we both are long-term friends of Marge's and Joe's and Percy's. And it's fun because we're doing it together. What's not fun is that it came out of what could have been a potential fatality. So we're excited.
Well, I just shared a link into the chat to a story from News Channel 6, and you can see Percy there and all of his glory and just adorableness. But Holly's right, that story's been everywhere.
So if you ever want to know how to promote a bill, you might have, instead of taking a cheese making class for Marge Kilkelly, a bill promoting class for Marge Kilkelly. I've learned from the master now, if you want your bill to get attention, how to get it done.
She is indeed the master. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. And we're going to pass it this time, and it failed last time, but I know we're going to pass it this time.
Good. That's wonderful. You know, I think this is maybe one of our longest running meetings yet, 9:08. Thank you all for sticking in here. Thank you all for coming. This was a great turnout. We've got a lot of work ahead of us in the next couple of months, but I can see from everybody here tonight that we're going to get to it. We're going to get it done. Thanks to you all, and keep your eye out for some updates and a link to the recording.